All right, well, this week all eyes were on Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and the implications it had for our relationship with China. And our next guest, Matt Stoller, points out an important connection that a lot of the public probably missed in the media coverage weeks ago regarding our relationship with China as the United States. One high-ranking official from the Air Force warned that if the U.S. doesn't get better at buying weapons, America will lose in a future conflict to China.
Research director at the American Economic Liberties Project and author of The Big Substack, Matt Stoller, joins us now to discuss.
Matt, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm told that you and Katie have known each other for years, so I'm glad that we're all here for this moment.
Yeah, we're trying not to make you feel left out.
Yeah, I'm totally third wheeling with Stoller and Katie.
I'm totally want to make you feel left out.
Yeah, that's the difference between me and Matt.
Yeah,
Katie and I are just like that.
Yeah. Remember 10 years ago?
I'm going to go full Milton Friedman and defend the monopolies in this segment.
Yeah, that's the price that we're going to pay, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. They need the help.
Never go full Friedman. But that's what we're doing. We're doing here sort of a little deep dive into this, and I highly recommend folks go and read this piece on Matt's Substack. It's called Nancy Pelosi, China, and the Slow Decline of the U.S. Military. And basically, Matt, you're contextualizing all of the tensions over the Pelosi visit in this context of we're kind of boiling right now. These tensions are boiling, and something could happen really at any moment. What does the preparation of the U.S. military look like? Can you tell us how, we'll dive into the details of this, but how, from a basic perspective, consolidation has been a force that's really weakened our military in recent years?
Yeah, so traditionally, America, our military strategy, almost going back to the revolution, was you need to have a lot of productive capacity here that you can turn into military production. Like in World War II, we made a lot of cars and then switched those factories over to tanks and so on and so forth. And two things happened in the 1980s and 90s, as you saw tremendous consolidation and offshoring of that industrial base, but you also saw the companies that were specifically dedicated to military equipment have a massive merger wave. So we had about 100 what are called prime contractors in the 1990s, and then the Clinton administration explicitly told them the Cold War is over, merge, and we shrank that down to 5. So that's like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Boeing, and there's one more I'm missing it. But if you notice, Lockheed Martin has 2 names. That's because it's several companies together. Anyway, what happened after the 1990s in this very consolidated marketplace is that weapons just got a lot more expensive and a lot worse, because that's what happens when there's no competition. And there were also regulatory changes, so contracting changes, part of the Reinventing Government initiative under Bill Clinton, and then changes under George W. Bush. It made it much harder for the government to negotiate with these contractors. And so they said, there were a couple of changes. And what this article highlights is that now we're at a point where we can't produce enough weapons at a low enough cost that to actually sustain the military posture that we have. And this is, General Cameron Holt, who's in the Air Force, actually just said this. And he said, China spends less on weapons than we do, but they're more efficient at buying it because they don't have this monopolized structure, honestly. And over time, China will become a better military than we will if we don't address this problem. And there are some things in Congress going on to address the problem, so it's not hopeless. But the military-industrial complex that got super corrupt, and there's always problems with it, but got super corrupt after the 1990s, that is actually inhibiting our ability to have a military that can actually fight at this point.
Mm.
I mean, I do wonder, though, how much questions of security now have to do with climate change.
Yeah, there are lots of strategic choices, right, that we have to make in terms of a policy, like policies about what we're going to be doing. And I wanted to okay, so there's lots of things on climate change. There's things like, are we handling China appropriately? Are we doing the right thing in Ukraine, and so on and so forth, Iran, whatever. Those are policy decisions that I think we can have discussions over. But there's also the guts of whether we actually are able to project power. Like, can we make and resupply aircraft carriers. It's a different question than where to use those aircraft carriers, but can we actually do it? And that's what I was really trying to focus on, because the fact that Nancy Pelosi was able to go to Taiwan, I mean, you don't see any other country challenging China in this way, and the reason is because they're all afraid. But we're not, because we have this military capacity, and China knows it. Now, whether it was a good idea for her to go is a different question, but we won't necessarily have that choice in the future. Like, we will have to do what China wants if we continue to buy weapons at such a bloated posture. And maybe that's what people want, but we won't actually have the ability to have that policy discussion.
And how has consolidation affected the security of supply chains? I think that's another really important question in terms of when we do need to increase our supply of certain weapons. When we do find ourselves in a hot conflict, can we manufacture the right weapons, the best weapons, or is consolidation, is monopolization a big problem there too?
It's a huge problem. I mean, we sent a bunch of Javelins and Stinger missiles to Ukraine. One of the biggest problems is we can't replace them. We just don't have the capacity to do that. I mean, spinning up the assembly lines is going to take a few years. And so whatever we're sending to Ukraine, that's out of our own stocks, and there's nothing, the cupboard will be bare if we keep sending stuff. And that's a function of not having spare military capacity, which is really a consolidation story. So if you have, during World War II, we had roughly a dozen contractors at least for every major prime weapon system, right? So if one company was having trouble making tanks or making a certain form of aircraft, the government could just go to a different one and say, here's the specs, here's the technology, here's a contract, and then they would produce it. And we don't actually have that ability anymore, right? Like if Lockheed can't make Stingers, we don't have Stingers, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like the consolidation is about not just pooling market power, but it's also about pooling productive capacity and often chopping up that, like reducing that productive capacity so that the firms can have higher margins. Well, when you do that, right, then what you're doing, you're running on a very thin supply chain, and you can't actually expand when you need to. And it's sort of a crazy thing to do. Like, I get it with the civilian economy. It's a bad idea to have thin globalized supply chains, but there is some argument for efficiency. But when you're talking about weaponry, like, war is a giant supply chain crisis. So the idea that you wouldn't have spare capacity and you would consolidate like the way that we've done, and that we have contracting rules so the government actually has very little cost data or intellectual property information about the weapons they're buying. That is crazy. These are crazy choices that we've made to put power in the hands of contractors. They're not going to be on the battlefield. Like, they're not going to be fighting. It's actually the soldiers that are going to be fighting and the government that's going to be financing that. And we need to make sure that the power is where it needs to be to actually have a coherent military that can actually do what we need it to do. And again, I'm not arguing that the military should do one thing or the other. I'm just saying, if you want to have like a policy choice about whether to stand up to China, then you need to be able to do that. And increasingly, we will not be able to. I mean, we have 5 or 10 years, but like, it's bad, and it's been bad since the 90s.
Your piece also talks about the way that certain weapons or certain equipment is classified as commercial. Right. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so like when you talk about procurement, it's super nerdy and annoying and all the language is polluted, so it's really hard to describe. But one of the things that happened in the 1990s, the way that they corrupted contracting is they said that anything that is that there used to be, like, the Pentagon has certain ways to buy nuclear submarines, right? They get to look at cost data, because they're the only ones that buys nuclear submarines. But when they buy pencils, they have a different regime where they don't get to look at the cost basis for pencils or personal computers or whatever, because it's already sold in the commercial marketplace. And so they can pretty well assume that competition makes the price reasonable. And what they did in the 1990s, and they keep worsening this over time, is they've said, well, commercial items, that we're going to dub sort of almost anything as a commercial item, which means that the government won't actually have the ability to look at cost data or pricing on commercial items. And when commercial items apply to things like, the C-130 military transport, or, large subsystems of the F-35, like they're not commercial items. It's just a way of making sure that the government has no information about what it costs. And so, margins for a bunch of these items can go way, way up, and the ability for the government to have bargaining power goes way, way down. And that's like this consistent pattern that you see on the armed services committees is to continue to widen the definition of commercial items so that it encompasses anything, to the point where military contractors actually brag about the need for more commercial item exceptions. It's a crazy loophole. Both sides of the aisle are indicted in this one. There are attempts in the current military authorization bill to sort of narrow it and close it. There's been some discussions over the last few years to do that. It would be a really good thing if that happened. But that's like one of the big fights in sort of the military procurement space.
Just going to go down to Walmart and pick up an F-35.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
Well, yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that question, that section of your article, because you have a great line where you say contractors aren't just sneaking in loopholes, they're advertising loopholes.
Yeah. Right.
And Matt, you've worked on the Hill. And my question for you is, obviously the military-industrial complex is well known to the vast majority of the country at this point, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan. People get it. They know how lobbying affects this. They know how the incentives that the contractors have affects all of this. Could you speak to how the influence of lobbying has affected consolidation? You were just mentioning how it goes on the armed services committees. What does that look like up close when you're sort of glancing at particular examples?
Well, what really it's coming from a lot of the revolving door at the Pentagon. So, officers leave the Pentagon and they know they're going to go to a defense contractor. And so they want to protect the ability of the defense contractors to do business. But also a lot of them have been convinced that it's just a great honor if a defense company would deign to do business with the Pentagon, which is super weird, right? So there's this constant discussion on the Hill and in the Pentagon is, why won't anyone do business with us? And it's just like, it's crazy because companies would love to do business with the Pentagon, and they are just, but they've convinced themselves. It's like Walmart, right, or Amazon. Like, these are huge buyers, and they just tell their suppliers what to do because they have massive buying power. The Pentagon is much bigger as a buyer than either Walmart or Amazon, but for some reason, people at the Pentagon think that it's just such a huge favor for anybody to do business with them. So it's a very weird mindset. It's part of that whole neoliberal mindset that goes back, 40 years that you see kind of all over the place. Some of the younger officers don't think that way, but the lobbying is important, the revolving door, and in the way that the armed services committees, when you talk to them about any of this, it's like talking to a wall. They just sort of don't care. They're not interested. They have the same attitude, which is that like the contract, we're lucky that the contractors are willing to do business with the U.S. And they are often pro-consolidation. It's very weird mindset. People get that the military-industrial complex is corrupt, but what I don't think they understand is that it's undermining the ability of the U.S. military to function, right? So like on the left, you see people saying, oh, it's just pushing us into more wars and that's the general approach. But it's like, that's actually not what's pushing us into wars. Lockheed is going to be fine no matter whether we're in a war or not. What's happening is it's destroying the ability to actually sustain war and sustain weapons. And so it's not that we're going to get into fewer wars, right? That's not what's going to happen if you destroy your military capacity. It's that the wars are going to go on longer. We're going to lose. More people are going to die. More civilians are going to die. It's like that's what happens when you don't have the capacity to produce weapons. And yet you still have a posture which presumes that we can actually hold certain geopolitical aims in mind. And so like that's where we are right now. I think we need to move away from the idea that the military-industrial complex is simply bad and towards understanding that it's there for a reason and it's not fulfilling that mission. And what we need is for them to be building weapons that actually work, that are cheap, instead of just building, McMansions in the suburbs of DC, which is what's happening.
Right, like if we're going to have an industrial policy, which is sort of necessary in the military, it should serve the military, not Wall Street.
That's right.
Right. I think the three of us probably disagree about what the role should be of the military-industrial complex, but I do think that what's interesting about this is we see how the military-industrial complex is not even functional. It's inefficient. And it's done in a way that, from my perspective, it's kind of funny to watch capitalism, like some of market capitalism, undermine the military-industrial complex.
Crony capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting tension that we have right now. And I don't want to overstate it, right? I mean, the U.S. government does a lot of things right that we don't talk about. Like, for example, the only reason we have a good monkeypox vaccine, we don't have enough of it, is because the U.S. government funded a Danish company to build it. And that's actually true for like RNA, for the COVID vaccines. And for like, there's a lot of stuff that we do that like a lot of alternative energy sources developed with defense money. Like, it's not that it's all just a disaster, right? It's that it's and a lot of it worked,
That's our
right?
foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just like the policy of whether to go to war, the policy of how to, like we made horrible decisions. Like going to Iraq was a really bad decision. But the idea that you have weapons that work or don't is just a function of like, that has almost nothing to do with whether you go to war or not. It has to do with whether you can win or lose wars. But that's like, I think we need to like reorient and just say, look, we need a military. Every country has one. We have national security interests. We have to protect ourselves. There are certain things that we need to do in the world. And let's make sure that we have that military, that we spend what's necessary and not too much, because like we're way overspending and getting a lot less for it. But then that we're also making the policy decisions about what to do with our military power in a reasonable way, and that we don't conflate them. We don't say, we don't like the military, so let's destroy the ability to make weapons. No, what we should be doing, because, a lot of times when you're like building a weapon system, you're building it in a way that like you can shoot it and maybe it won't hit civilians, but will hit military targets better, right? Or more accurately. Like, and if you screw that up, then it's just like more likely to hit civilians. Like that's a legitimate like scenario. So the point is let's be clear about the policy problems here and the operational problems, and like let's make sure to disentangle the two of them.
Yeah, and another interesting point there you just raised is how we're spending more and getting less for it. Right. And on that note, a lot of Republicans were really upset. And just like the sort of woke complaints about training in the military exploded last year when Mark Milley talked about, I think it was white rage in a hearing on Capitol Hill. And I wonder, Matt, if this new sort of era for the Republican Party, a post-Bush era for the Republican Party, where Republicans are increasingly agitated by the top brass and also increasingly less beholden to corporations because they've made this sort of cultural divorce. Granted, Katie and I were talking earlier in the show about who celebrated the CHIPS bill that passed last week, none other than Lockheed Martin. But at least on the surface, there's that growing tension between the Republican Party and the military and even the contractors. So do you think that leads to any pathways for genuine bipartisan solutions to these problems?
It's an interesting question. So just on the CHIPS bill, and like, just because Lockheed Martin likes something doesn't mean it's bad. It's not always a bad, like, there's an industrial policy is gonna have like winners, and Lockheed Martin lacks chips to build things. They want to build more now.
But they were responsive. They were responsive to the lobbying efforts in the bill, right? Like the
yeah. No, I mean I'm just putting that aside. Like Lockheed Martin is too big; it should be broken up. But like we do actually need semiconductors.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a really interesting question, and I think like when you're talking about the woke stuff, like on the right. One question is whether it's sort of like a divorce from corporate capture and cronyism, but it could be that. And I think a lot of sort of populist right wingers want that, and some of them believe that in the Senate and House. And you see that with tech antitrust bills. But it could also be a way of distracting from the corporate cronyism, right? And you also see that with the tech antitrust bills. Both the opponents and the proponents of those bills are using the arguments about wokeness. And I think with the defense contracting, I mean, the Democrats, like Gerald Connolly is terrible. Like he's just the worst. And there's just a bunch of like, there's some Gary Peters just passed a terrible bill in the Senate Government Reform Committee. But the Republicans are historically like much more contractor friendly and much worse than the Democrats on this stuff. It's not the Democrats are good, the Democrats are bad. Bill Clinton did a lot of this stuff, but he did it with Republican Congresses. And George Bush was terrible. And what you don't see, I think, from the sort of realignment right is like a real focus on some of these like operational areas, because there's really nothing about like, I mean, I guess you could look at Lockheed Martin and say, oh, they have a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, but like, it's a pretty long road from there to let's deal with the commercial item exception. And I haven't seen that happen. I hope it happens. Like, I hope that the populist right, actually starts to move some of the corporate stuff on its own account. And I could see that happening. I mean, I've seen arguments from some of them that this is a broader problem. It's not just these sort of cultural arguments, or maybe the cultural arguments are broader than just like, the way that they've been talked about. I haven't seen that. I want that to happen. I think that the arguments are being used by sort of both factions in the Republican Party. So we'll see. But it really does require understanding these details. Like, you have to track the details to know whether people are serious about their kind of anti-corporate rhetoric.
And I think it's important just for Republicans to see that this is downstream of the consolidation, the monopolization. It's right. Allowing cultural monopolization too.
Of course.
Yeah, that's right. Like,
of course. Sorry, Stoller, keep going.
No. I mean, I'm not. So again, put the policy questions aside about what kind of cultural choices you want to make. The question is whether it's Lockheed Martin or Disney or Google, or BlackRock, should a company that big be able to make those social choices one way or the other, right? And I think what we see on both sides of the aisle is that people don't think that it's appropriate for these firms to be making social decisions. Those are social decisions that we should be making as the public, through our political institutions, through our public institutions, and it shouldn't be a function. And I don't think that the CEOs want to be making these decisions,
nope.
but they have to, because because they're monopolies, right? In order to gain that monopoly power, you have to be a very powerful institution, which inherently comes with social power. So they would prefer not to have that social power, but they want the monopoly, and the social power comes with it. And so you're 100% right when you say that these cultural questions, this social power, is downstream from market power. And I hope that both sides actually start to get there and recognize that the social power itself is intrinsically dangerous. That concentration of power is intrinsically dangerous.
My favorite woke CIA moment, of course, is that Latinx woman talking about how she has like an anxiety disorder. I'm like, well, maybe it's from bombing so many black and brown people as a woke Latinx. That's my 2 cents.
You think maybe that would have something to do with it?
Yeah. Gives you agita.
I don't have anything to add on anxiety.
Yeah. Well, luckily we did not book you to talk about that, so no pressure on that one.
I wish I had like the superpower of like sort of like rolling my eyes like 5 times in a row.
Yeah.
There's just so many eye rolls.
Yeah, you'll get there. It takes practice.
Someday.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Matt.
Matt Stoller, we always appreciate it. Go check out Matt's Substack. It's a great follow. Thanks so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. We love doing these deep dives. We were thinking about doing more deep dives here on Rising Fridays, and Stoller seemed like a great choice. Awesome discussion.
Very wonky.
Absolutely.
In the best way.
In the best way. And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.